Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Political State from the Oklahoman. I'm Ben Felder. Joining me is the Political State crew, Dale and Justin. After a break last week, we're back at it, and things have changed somewhat since the last time we were with you. The special session of the legislature is winding down, as it looks like tax cuts are going to be what or not tax cuts, budget cuts are what we're left with after a tax increase proposal failed to make its way through the House. And we're entering into the regular session, so the pace kind of changes. There was a sense of urgency with the budget over the last couple of weeks. Now we're entering the regular session when, you know, it's typical that we just kind of wait to the last minute. So we have a few months, right?
Yeah, well, finally, right? 2018, the budget year, the budget for 2018 is pretty much done. We know what is going to happen. About $44 million in budget cuts to almost every state agency. That's about 2% of the remaining budget, or the remaining spending availability for a lot of these agencies. And so now we're looking at what's going to happen in 2019, the fiscal year 2019, which starts July 1st.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to catch everyone up to speed, so it was, you know, the Step Up Oklahoma plan, this series of tax increases.
It all failed.
That all failed. Didn't get the votes it needed at the House. Not really even that close, really. And that was to shore this gap for the current budget year we're in now. So the governor is expected to sign this budget that includes cuts. And now we're moving into the regular session. And like I said, usually that budget gets done, you know, near the end of session.
Late May.
It seems like things have kind of maybe slowed down. You expect that to be any different this year?
I think probably they'll wait as long as they can, just like they do in every other year. So far what I've heard is no optimism at all that there are going to be any kind of revenue increases to cover the $167 million budget shortfall that we know is going to happen in the next budget year. And so, you know, with it, they could decide to raise some taxes somehow, but it's an election year. No one thinks that. Hardly anyone thought it last year. They could eliminate some tax exemptions. Like, for instance, if you go out and buy something right now that's tax exempt, legislature could say, okay, well, now you have to start paying tax on that. That could be another way to gin up some money. And finally, the most straightforward way is to simply reduce the state budget by that amount.
Yeah. And,
you know, that's going to be just more cuts for state agencies.
Yeah. You know, I think there's some people who are saying, like, well, hey, we still have a few months. Why is it unlikely that we'll see it? I mean, everyone was talking about increasing taxes just a few weeks ago, but you don't even think that it's likely that we'll even see a proposal, you know, brought to the House floor again or make it out of committee. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I don't foresee any kind of tax increase proposals. I mean, obviously they could try. They could come to some kind of agreement and say this is what we're going to work on. But if history is any indicator, you know, we're working with the same people. The composition of the legislature hasn't changed aside from adding a couple of Democrats and a Republican. And so you're working with the same people, and now they're under the sort of the political pressure of running for re-election in the primary, and that's going to change things. It's going to make things more difficult, obviously, for them to want to even consider tax increases.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's why even, you know, I'm not optimistic that we're going to see any kind of tax increase proposals. I don't predict that, I guess you could say.
At least not the ones that'll draw a vote. Yeah, Justin.
Yeah. Because they have more time, shouldn't they be able to at least take a better look at the budget and not hit every agency if they want to avoid that? I mean, that in some ways is the fairest way, but I know there are some conservatives who think there's a lot of waste out there, and that if you take a hard look at certain agency budgets, you can find that waste. Ideally, over several months now, you don't have to rush a budget deal, and you can start to take a finer look at that. Is there momentum for something like that? I hear it among conservatives sometimes, and taking kind of a scalpel to certain agencies rather than just one hatchet across.
Yeah, and that may be the sort of the motivation for the Senate having budget hearings, another round of bringing agencies in to talk about what does your budget look like, what is your spending focused on. And you know, yeah, we're going to see a lot of that, and it doesn't necessarily have to be $167 million cut straight off the top of every agency. hardly anyone actually wants to do that because you have agencies that you want to protect.
Right.
You have agencies that you don't want to give that much of a cut to, or you simply can't because they have sort of maintenance of needs problems.
Yeah.
They have federal grants that they have to match,
Exactly, yeah.
et cetera. And so, yeah, you really do have to kind of think carefully about where you implement these cuts and how these cuts are going to affect agencies. Every agency is going to say that these cuts are going to be severely disabling for us, right?
Right.
You have to expect that. But it's up to the lawmakers to find out, which of those statements are more true.
Yeah. So Justin, you're saying now they've got more time, so now that they've got plenty of time to maybe figure this out.
Right. That should be a benefit to the amount of time you have. That
should be.
That should be.
Should be.
Even if you're not going to go the way of raising new revenue, you should at least be able to take a smarter look at your budget cuts and do it in a way that's, I don't know, maybe smart is unfair to the lawmakers, but just a more intricate look at budget cuts and a finer look at those if you're going to make budget cuts. And ideally you'd make them in ways that are not as damaging to state agencies.
Yeah. Well, like you said, Dale, I mean, we're dealing with the same group of actors here. I mean, that hasn't been their MO in the past. In an election year, yeah. I mean, there were a lot of kids this year, or this week, that had no school because of winter weather, and maybe they had an assignment due the next day, that now they had an extra day to work on it. I'm guessing most of them didn't take that extra day to actually spend more time on it. They probably procrastinated until the last night like they would have the week before.
How often do you compare lawmakers to children?
Children,
it routinely happens.
It happens a few times. Or reporters waiting to the deadline. Okay, I'll throw myself in there. My point is that if they were to take a serious look at the budget, starting right now, and take advantage of the next few months that they have, that would be a reversal from what we have seen.
Yeah,
is all I'm saying with that.
You're right.
I think that with the budget. Some people, so for example, a lot of talk this last couple of weeks about whether education groups, teachers might try to have some kind of work stoppage and pressure a vote. Talking with one of the leaders of the state's biggest teachers union, I mean, he was saying, yeah, I think a strike could be possible, but you need something. You need something to fight for. You need a bill on the floor. You need a vote that you're trying to pressure. When we harken back to 1990, the last time there was a teacher work stoppage, I mean, it was for 1017. It was for the emergency on that House bill, and 4 days of a work stoppage to push it through. But it sounds like that scenario may not even work out. I mean, if there's not going to be a bill, I mean, there's been plenty of ideas. I mean, Democrats are probably going to continue to talk about their ideas for how to increase taxes and fill the budget. But it's one thing to talk about it, which there'll be a lot of talk, but it's another thing to actually see a vote, and it just doesn't seem like we're probably going to see that.
Right, and we're still early in the legislative process for 2019. We're not even yet to the point at which bills need to be out of committee. It's still a couple weeks away.
Yeah.
And we've got a lot of time ahead of us so far legislatively. And if there is a bill out there that sneaks its way through the legislative process to a point at which a work stoppage or a walkout or a protest or whatever you want to call it would be useful, that's a little ways down the line.
Yeah.
So to be clear, you're saying the step-up plan was not that.
Well, I think the step-up plan, when I asked that question directly, well, it wasn't that it was too large. It was just there wasn't a feeling, I think because it was so early in the session, well, it was part of the second special session, right? And I think that there was a lot of momentum around it. I think if you talk to, like, for example, teacher union leaders, they would say, hey, there's a lot of momentum around it, some positive momentum. We think that's the best play right now. We want to continue to encourage our lawmakers. We don't. I mean, a teacher strike is kind of a break the glass. This is the last thing that you do. And I don't think that they felt like they were there yet. I think there were plenty of teachers that probably felt that way. Most, I don't know, but I could see a scenario where, I mean, last time we saw it, it was in April, when we had the last teacher strike in 1990. I mean, kind of at the end where you feel like we're running out of time. And like I said, I know it was a special session compared to the regular session. I don't know that most Oklahomans are really, I mean, separating the two. I think they just see it as a budget in crisis, and
sure,
there needs to be a fix. But yeah, I think if the step-up plan were brought forward again in April or May, yeah, maybe there would be a little bit more of a, this is our last shot, and maybe some kind of action beyond just lobbying our lawmakers needs to happen. But I don't doesn't sound like we're going to see that.
I thought maybe it wasn't narrowly tailored enough for a teachers union to say this is our bill. This is a teacher bill, a teacher pay bill, and therefore we have to make a grandstand on it. It's such a big bill.
Well, what's interesting to me is that I think when you look at the interesting bedfellows with the Step Up plan. I mean, you had some organizations and some individuals coming together outside of the Capitol that don't always see eye to eye or don't always agree. I mean, inside the Capitol, it was still a pretty big partisan split for the most part, or at least enough to kill it. But I think for the teachers, hey, it included teacher pay raise. That's what we're focused on. That's what we want. For health organizations, I mean, I think everyone was really able to tailor, look at the aspect that was good for them, and be willing to support the whole package, which was probably, if those that thought Step Up would pass, that's probably what they were banking on, that there's enough in here to please everybody. I mean, the joke was that there's enough in here to tick off everybody and annoy everyone, but there was also enough in here to please everybody. Now, some groups like State Employee Union and other groups like that kind of felt like they were left out, but for the most part, the big groups in the state were included, and even that wasn't enough to get it through. I mean, so that's done. I mean, we're not hearing any. I haven't heard any chatter. I mean, I'm still seeing advertising and stuff for it, but I mean, I don't know if those are just bias that are continuing to run their course.
Yeah, I think for the most part, Step Up Oklahoma is done. There are ideas in there, obviously, that House leadership would like to, to keep going, but for the most part, it's done. I don't foresee any push to continue it in that, at least in that name.
Yeah. Well, the focus has kind of moved away from the budget for a while. Now we've got a little bit more time, so now we're back in kind of the normal routine where we kind of, you start seeing a lot of attention paid to bills that probably don't have much of a chance or that are somewhat controversial. I mean, obviously we're talking this week about, whether or not we should even participate in daylight savings time or if we should, put "In God We Trust" in every classroom. I mean, so it kind of feels normal now. Now we're kind of back to the normal routine of the legislature, right?
This is familiar territory.
Yes.
It's really going to give your Capitol reporters a better chance to give you a sense of what is on the minds of legislators. We've been totally focused on the budget for the last 18 months, and it's kind of, I think, worn a lot of people down. And now that we can, say, okay, now we have, about a couple of months at least until we have to start writing about the budget every day, then now we can focus on some of the more important things, like criminal justice reform.
Yeah.
There's still some bills that haven't yet had their final hearing, and we know that the District Attorney's Council is lobbying pretty hard to amend those bills before they come back to the House and Senate floors, and even amend them in a way to kind of put off some of the reforms that the criminal justice advocates want to see, and say that is needed immediately. So that's a pretty big conflict out there. So we'll up at the Capitol, just keep following us, and we'll tell you what's going on.
Yeah, other things going on besides the budget and some important stuff.
Yeah.
It's not all just kind of the sexy stories of controversial stuff.
Sure.
But there's plenty of that also.
Yeah.
Right. Especially in election year, those sometimes play well back in some districts. Well, Justin, taking a look at the national landscape, obviously the conversation continues to be around last week, over a week ago, the shooting at Douglas High School in Florida. Right. One thing that's unique about this, I think, and you and I were talking about this week, and people have been talking about the fact that this is still a major part of the national conversation. When sometimes these mass shootings, kind of fade away after a couple of days, especially in the modern news cycle.
Oftentimes.
Yeah,
more often than not.
There's probably a couple reasons for that. One, I think we're obviously seeing, kind of the image of students from that school that are speaking out, that are going to the state and U.S. Capitol to advocate for gun control. So it's brought gun control back into the national conversation. I mean, you looked at Oklahoma's delegation, and you probably could have guessed before even making those calls, but what did you find, in terms of what was their response to this renewed idea of gun control?
Yeah, at some point you could almost put out the same response every time, and sadly that is how often we have these shootings, and how often I would, poll members of Congress from Oklahoma on this issue. You typically see a pretty hardline stance, and there's not a lot of flexibility there and willingness to enact measures. When there is, they're rather small measures, like getting rid of bump stocks. I've heard Lankford talk about that a little bit. he's probably the one who talks about it the most. There's some other talk there among Inhofe and others who are willing to consider it, or at least let ATF consider it. And so you have some rather small measures like that. Langford was at the Rotary Club here downtown on Tuesday, and he did kind of his brief update, 10-15 minutes, on what he thought was most important in Washington. They turned it over for questions. He chose to focus on immigration and the budget and tax cuts. The questions almost always, all of them focused on guns or shootings, school security, a lot of those issues kind of bundle together there. So Langford has sort of bureaucratic fixes to things. He wants to kind of work within the system. ATF should take a look at bump stocks, or schools should look at their own security, things like that. Not as far as the president would go in arming teachers. I haven't heard any talk of that from the delegation. But by and large, there hasn't been a lot of response in terms of firearms. Now, there's a societal response here. You hear this a lot from Steve Russell, and you also hear it a lot from Mark Wayne Mullen. Time and time again when these shootings happen, that there's something wrong with society, that there's a sickness within society. Hollywood often takes the blame, and video games often take the blame, from those two especially. So they tend to point at what they see as societal ills that would lead to something like this, and they see the gun as being just another tool. It could have been any tool. Why would you regulate that when you're not regulating what they see as the cause of the problem? Again, violent video games, violence in Hollywood, and a shift away from Judeo-Christian values.
Yeah,
especially from Russell.
Yeah. Well, whenever we're having this debate or this conversation, I mean, I think it just continues, especially in modern America. It comes down to, this is another, aspect of quote unquote the culture wars. I mean, there's that interesting, map that kind of floats around showing that if gun owners were the only ones allowed to vote, Trump would have won almost every state except for one, I think. One, it was a New England state, maybe he wouldn't have. And if those who didn't own a gun were the only ones voting, Clinton would have won every election. I think with the exception of maybe Wyoming or something like that. So I mean, this is really kind of a stark division. I mean, obviously with Oklahoma's delegation, there's nothing controversial in Oklahoma about saying that you support, the right to bear arms and that you are against restricting access to guns. I mean, it's a major part of Oklahoma culture.
It was interesting to see a couple of other news outlets, aside from us, look at the NRA money that Oklahoma members of Congress have received, and many were surprised to find that there's not a lot. That's because they're not competitive races, and that there's no question. You don't have to persuade members of Congress from Oklahoma to support pro-gun or pro-firearm rights legislation.
You don't have to try very hard to get someone like that elected.
No, not at all. I mean, exactly. So you're not going to see a lot of NRA donations there because there doesn't need to be. These are not battleground elections, aside from maybe the 5th Congressional this year. But otherwise, these are not members of Congress that you have to persuade to be to your side if you're the NRA.
Yeah, and I think it's been interesting watching kind of, there's Republican members of the Florida delegation, who haven't really budged too much at all, but they're in the thick of it, right? I mean, we look at Senator Rubio, who's kind of, he's kind of had to, he's getting a lot of attention for his presence at that CNN town hall this week. And Florida's a little bit more of a purple state. I mean, red this last election, but a lot more balanced than, say, a state like Oklahoma. It would be interesting, and obviously I'm not wishing this, but I mean, it would be interesting to see what that conversation would look like if an incident happened here in Oklahoma. I mean, it's just not I don't want to say it's not relevant to Oklahoma, but a lot of this conversation is taking place kind of nationally and kind of looking at the fight between Republicans and Democrats. Well, when you're such a red state like Oklahoma, I mean, it really isn't much of a debate right now. I mean, are we seeing, I guess, have you seen anything out of the Capitol? I kind of wonder if there's going to be any kind of bills filed that would arm teachers or any conversations like that? Or
I haven't, nothing has really come out of the fray as far as really any kind of gun law. I think if you polled our legislature, they would say our gun laws in Oklahoma are pretty much fine. As they are. You always see some tweaks here and there every year, but for the most part, Oklahoma's gun laws have been fairly static.
Mm-hmm. Well, what will be interesting to me is if this how much longer this is a part of the national conversation. We're still talking gun control a week from now. There's still, the top story every hour is, these kids protesting in D.C. in their state capitol, and the president continues to have to talk about gun control. And he continues to talk about the idea of arming teachers. I just kind of wonder, is that going to seep into? You are going to see some maybe liberal states or purple states where some Democrats may file legislation to try to control guns. But I just have to think that if this keeps going, at some point you're going to see conservative states like Oklahoma maybe even look, say, well, okay, well, what's our response to this? Well, maybe it is arming teachers, or maybe it is,
And how long until the politically active youth here in Oklahoma City start coming to the Capitol every day?
Yeah,
there's quite a few of them.
Yeah, well, there are a couple national rallies planned. I think the first one is in March. I want to say March 14th. I think is it a month anniversary?
I'm not familiar.
I'm not sure. I know I've noted them because it's going to be interesting to see what it looks like here. Sure. I mean, of course, there's going to be a lot of, it's going to resonate in places like Florida and maybe even some, blue states. But it's going to be really interesting to see what that looks like here and to see if it's mobilized. Once again, a week from now, this maybe isn't a conversation. But
800 news cycles from now.
Yeah. But the fact that we're still talking about it, over a week since it happened, it's definitely unique from what we've seen in recent years. So, well, that's going to do it for this first segment of Political State. We're going to be back in round two. I'm going to be joined with two Republican representatives. We're going to be talking about the session from their perspective and also kind of drilling in a little bit more on the issue of education funding, teacher pay, and what to look out for in the next few months of the legislative session here in Oklahoma. Dale, Justin, thanks for joining me. I'm Ben with the Oklahoman. We'll be back with Political State right after this short break. Hello and welcome back to Political State from the Oklahoman. I'm Ben Felder, and in the second half of our episode this week, I'm joined by two representatives of the Oklahoma State House. Joining me here is Representative Rhonda Baker and Representative Tammy West. Reps, thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, especially for your time right here in the middle of a session, or we're ending a special session. We're in still the beginning stages of a regular session, so a busy time, although it's been a busy year, really, politically speaking, for the legislature, hasn't it?
It has. We've had a lot that has been given to us, a lot of challenges that we've had to face head on that we weren't necessarily thinking we were going to be faced with when we got elected, but we have dug our heels in and we have made some tough votes and have decided that we want to do what we really feel is best for education in our state and for the citizens to make our state much better.
Yeah, well, I want to talk about some of those tough votes here in a moment. But one thing, one of the reasons I'm really looking forward to this conversation is you both have pretty strong education backgrounds. Representative Baker, former teacher, Representative West, former member of the, it was a Putnam City School Board, excuse me.
City School Board, yes.
You represent part of Bethany
yes,
in your district. So obviously, I mean, education, I mean, you can't find a lawmaker that won't talk about education. But you both come from a real kind of in the trenches perspective, both in the classroom and running a school district. Give me your perspective with that education eye, assuming that that's kind of a dominant way that you look at some things. I mean, how would you kind of judge the last year's legislature and moving forward when it comes to, education here in the state?
Well, it was a difficult year. I think we were both frustrated and disappointed because as Republican members of the House of Representatives, one of our goals as a caucus was for a teacher pay raise this year. Mm-hmm. We worked very hard this year to accomplish that. It is still a goal. It is still at the forefront of every decision that we're making. We realize both being in that lifestyle of education, but also hearing it on the doorstep, being recently elected, we know how important this is for our families. And we've seen what has happened. We've lived it. As a member of the Putnam City School Board, one of the first things when I was elected, we cut $12 million from the budget. Those were hard decisions. But then we went through a process of dealing with standards changing multiple times. 2008, we were doing No Child Left Behind. Then we went to PASS standards. Then we went to Common Core. Then we went back to PASS, and now we're doing the Oklahoma State standards. All of that involved money. It involved changes. Things that we had to deal with in education, and I think that has led to one of the reasons that we've lost a lot of the human capital, our educators, led to now classrooms being overcrowded, the pay cut, very expensive on many, many levels. So those are all things that I walked into it realizing that had been done to education, and went in with an attitude of we need to be working with education. I know that Representative Baker had the same thing, but kind of lived it from a different standpoint and with the same goal of we're there to work to make improvements.
Yeah. Well, I mean, how much are you still in contact with maybe current or former school board members? I mean, and kind of what are what are they saying when they kind of corner you in a room? I mean, what are some of the things that you're hearing from some of your former colleagues?
Well, like everybody else, they want it fixed.
Yeah.
Still very close. I think both of us are still very much a part of our old lifestyle is still a part of how we live. Got a text this morning from one of the school board members, superintendents, both at Bethany and Putnam City Schools, and relationships we built with Oklahoma City Schools. Being in that life, they're friendships. They're not just business relationships, and they're resources now. I don't think there's anything that I vote on with regards to education that I don't make a phone call or send a text message saying, what is this going to look like in the classroom with teachers and children, and are there any unintended consequences that I'm not seeing in the reading of this bill?
Yeah, and Representative Baker, I mean, for you as a former teacher, I mean, how much are you still in contact with some of your former colleagues that are still in the classroom, still teaching?
You know, I still am. I have them give me calls probably every week. I mean, I'll keep in touch with the team members that I worked with, and you know, especially with this step-up plan, their frustration has been, you know, why do people not understand or hear us when we, you know, explain to them why it's so important that we have a teacher pay raise. You know, why is it that it's not being taken as seriously as it should be? And that's scary to me. I, in fact, had a teacher reach out to me just yesterday, and we had a long conversation, and she had to explain that, you know, there's rumblings that teachers are going to be walking out. Are you hearing that? And yes, I've heard that. It's really sad that we've come to that point. And I mean, again, as I said previously, we've made some hard votes to make sure that we didn't get to this position. It has not happened the way we have wanted it to happen, but if we do not this session do something to gain some revenue and to give these teachers a pay raise that they need, I think that we're truly on the precipice of a disaster.
Yeah. We both were referencing votes. You talked about the Step Up Oklahoma plan, so, you know, a series of tax increases, you know, that the high bar that it takes to pass, you know, revenue-raising measures in the legislature came up short a couple weeks ago, and so that was to fill the current fiscal year. We're seeing those cuts. Now it looks like there's going to be cuts that are going to be implemented. So now that we look at, you know, fiscal year 19, so the budget that this regular session is kind of geared towards, in the first half of this episode, I was talking to some of my colleagues, and we were, you know, Dale Denwald, our Capitol reporter, was saying, like, it's hard to imagine that there's going to be another vote to increase taxes that's going to be brought to the House floor for a variety of reasons. And it's an election year. You know, there doesn't seem to be any consensus. Would you like to see another vote brought, I mean, to the House floor, specifically related to teacher pay? Because that was one of the major components of this plan that you both voted in favor of it. Would you like to have another chance to vote for that this regular session?
The same package that we just went through previously, or is that what you're referring to?
I mean, yeah, but I mean, and of course, without knowing what the details are, I know it's hard to commit, but would you like to see another vote that has, are you open to voting for another package that increases revenue for a teacher pay raise?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
And what I'd like people to remember, the majority has voted for this every single time. You look at the votes on the board. In November, 72 votes.
Yeah.
In any other state,
yeah,
that was a vote that had 74.4% bipartisan support in the House and the Senate. We were 5 votes short. That is, the majority are pushing for these measures. This one last week, I think we were at 63 votes. The majority is wanting this. The state question 640, as a new legislator, I had no idea how important that was and how it would impact what we're trying to do. But there's a second part to the 640 that's beyond just the 3/4 of the vote. It's if you have a majority, 51 votes on that board, those initiatives can go to a vote of the people. I think that we may now be looking at taking things to a vote of the people. That is something that in 1992, the electorate determined would be in our Constitution. Revenue-raising measures had to have 3/4 support or a majority support for it to go onto a ballot.
Yeah.
That might be something we have to consider very seriously, because we have voted on the revenue package 4 different times over the last year. and no time since 1992 when State Coalition 640 was passed have we gotten 76 votes on the board.
Yeah. Well, we talk about you know, how tough of a vote that sometimes is, especially for Republican members in an election year. And some of the things that we talk a lot about on the show is, you know, when you look at how many, you know, just Republicans have voted, a couple years ago that would have been unheard of. I mean, to see that many, you know, supporting a tax increasing measure. What are, you know, we kind of talked about, you know, whether or not teachers are talking about, does there need to be a strike or some kind of work stoppage or that kind of thing. I mean, how likely do you think that is? I mean, when you're talking with some of your former colleagues.
You know, I'm not sure at this point how likely that is. The teachers that I taught with in UConn, they're very committed to the classroom, they're committed to their students. I don't see that they would ever want to do anything that would be a hindrance upon the children and taking away from their education. But I think that there are teachers that do want there to be a statement made that they really are serious and what does it take. I will tell you that that was why I got into the race to run for a state seat, is because of the low pay, the continual change in the standards, you know, ever increasing classroom sizes, and that has not changed. And so there really does have to be an understanding amongst these House members and even Senate, if it gets to the Senate side, that, you know, we have to come together as a group and fix this problem. It's not a Republican problem, it's not a Democratic problem, it's a problem within our state that we have to come together and fix. And until that changes, I don't think we're going to get very far. But the teachers are to the point of, you know, take us seriously. We've got to do something to get some attention on this issue.
Yeah. What kind of impact do you feel like you've had in the legislature? I mean, we've talked over the last couple of years of educators, and whether it's teachers or people who are affiliated with schools running, I mean, sometimes called the Teachers Caucus, and there's been, you know, a handful of members that have been elected over the last couple of years. And the idea is to get some people in the legislature that actually kind of know what it looks like to run a school district, to run a classroom. You know, how much do you feel like your colleagues in the legislature are listening to what you guys are saying?
I think they're listening. One of the things that I think both of us have discovered since we've been serving is how much the work that goes on in committees impacts what happens. So I think that we've been able to be very influential with making sure that bad legislation does not get out of committee and onto the floor. That's kind of that unsung work that gets done. So that I think we've been able to be effective at that. I don't mean just us, but those who've been elected and are new to the process. We've taken that very seriously, making sure we are watching the legislation that's coming through. Yeah. So from that standpoint, but I'm asked a lot. I mean, we are, I think, used as resources because we have resources. We don't just read a book and read a chapter and go, oh, this sounds great, or this worked in this state, let's try this. We're in contact with the financial managers of our school districts. We still have boots on the grounds. Yeah. And so I've been very pleased that people respect our opinions and do come to us.
Yeah. And same for you? Or?
Yeah, I agree. You know, interesting, coming in, our freshman class is very large, and knocking on the doors, they heard the same things that we were actually living. You know, these families that have children in school, they want what's best for those children. And so they want the education community to, you know, have some improvements made. And if that means that we pay our teachers more so that we don't continue losing those teachers, then they were for that. And so a large majority of those freshmen that I serve with, they understand that, they heard it, and they are very supportive of what we're trying to do up at the Capitol, which is to improve those educational outcomes. I think ultimately the people that have served for a long time that maybe they don't have those relationships with their educational community, they may be the ones that probably need to you know, get out and get a little bit more of an idea truly of what these families are saying, because I think there is some hesitance for some of them, especially on the Republican side, to raise any type of revenue, you know, for teacher pay raises.
Yeah.
It's just something that they have always promised that they would never do, is to vote on a tax. And as much as I respect that, I do believe that we are in a situation where the families are asking for something a little bit different. We're going to have to try this in a different way now.
Yeah. Well, I know neither one of you, ran on a tax increasing
No.
platform, obviously.
No, absolutely not.
But you made the vote in favor, of this package, and I imagine you also feel like your constituency, your Republican base that voted you in, is supportive of that. That you feel like that they, understood where you were coming from on this need to raise revenue, right?
Yeah. Well, the people that elected me knew I was a teacher. They knew that that's what I wanted to do, was go and improve the outcomes for education, and so they have been very supportive of that.
Yeah.
Yes.
How much of a sense of urgency do you feel like we're going to see now in the legislature, now that we've kind of are wrapping up fiscal year 18? Another thing we were talking about earlier on the episode is it feels like we're kind of returning to normal, where the budget is usually kind of the last thing you do. So now we have a few months until this regular session is over. Do you anticipate that the fiscal year 19 budget is going to be something that once again gets kind of addressed and band-aid at the end of the session, or how much of a sense of urgency do you think there exists to get something done in the next few weeks or next month?
Here's something I learned going in. This has been a year of learning.
Yeah.
The budget isn't left till the end. We had a budget that we sent to the Senate in March. Everybody remember the conversation about ball and dice. The Senate shot it down because of ball and dice. We had another one that had some health care issues that the Senate, when it was sent to the Senate, they wanted to tweak. That was in April. In May, we started with the packages that we've been working on and that we voted on in May. The cigarette fee was struck down by the Supreme Court. We're already working on the budget. We've never stopped. As soon as we were elected, we were working on the budget. We started going to meetings in December at the Capitol with no heat, working on the budget. So that was something, that was a myth that I had dispelled. We do realize it's a crisis. We've got close to 1,900 emergency certified teachers now. I can remember when I was on the school board going to one of the high schools before school started, as I would do. This is about 5 years ago, talking to one of the principals, and he was looking for a science teacher. And he said, Tammy, a couple of years ago I would have had 12 people lined up for this job, applying. Now I have no one. That's the crisis that we're in. We have got to refill the pipeline. We have to change the narrative that this is a profession that is worthy of being in. It is a career of choice. And we have got to get the students going into the teaching college and staying in Oklahoma to teach our students. We invest in 12 years of education in these kids, and we're training them to go to other states. We realize that. That is the crisis that I, as a legislator, feel. It's not just right now, yes, the teachers need a pay raise, so do our public employees. We've got a lot of work to do I think we've stopped digging the hole. We made some hard decisions last year that our revenue is up. We are hopefully swinging on the upside now, but now we've got to go in and work on filling the hole and not just band-aiding. So we do realize it's a crisis situation, and we've got to have qualified teachers in the classroom. We don't need to be training people that are going to go work in other states. And that's the urgency that I feel, and I think that we're trying to communicate to our colleagues.
Yeah. Well, and when you talk about it, the crisis that we're in, and when you talk to a lot of people in schools, that's exactly how they describe it. And I guess as we wrap up here, Representative Baker, what do you tell that teacher that feels like he or she has seen 640, the Step Up, our Plan A, Step Up Oklahoma, all these things fail, that and now they're part of the reason that there's talk about a strike or a walkout is because it feels like they've reached the end. Nothing's going to help. That hopeless, teacher. What do you tell them right now?
That is tough. I feel their anger and their frustration. That was exactly what I felt when I ran for office, and so it's really tough to look them in the eye and say, I'm sorry, but I'm continuing to fight for you. We have a lot of people in the House that feel the same way. The one thing that I do stress, it's very important that whoever your elected official is, you have to know their standpoint on education. And if you really truly start having conversations with some people, education is not necessarily a priority for everyone. And so it is important, though, that these teachers understand who their elected official is, develop a relationship with them. And that doesn't mean going to the Capitol and banging on their door and ranting and raving because maybe they didn't vote a particular way that they wanted, but to truly help them understand you know, what your needs are in a respectful way, and I think that that's just vitally important. Until then, though, to let them know that we appreciate everything that they're doing, because we do. Our teachers are asked to come to other states all the time because we train them so well, and so continue fighting the fight for us in Oklahoma and for our children, and we will continue to fight for them at the Capitol.
Yeah, well, as education continues to be a major theme in the legislature, a former teacher and former school board member bringing kind of that insider's perspective. Representatives, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it. That's going to do it for this week's episode of Political State, which you can always find at newsok.com in video form or on podcast form on your favorite podcast app. We'll be back again next week. Thanks for joining us. This is Political State. For the Oklahoman, I'm Ben Felder. We'll see you next Friday.